What begins as an innocent school project for twin sisters, Sophia and Emily Carson, soon spirals into a life-altering revelation that shakes the foundation of everything they thought they knew. A DNA test, meant to explore their family heritage, instead uncovers a web of secrets tied to an underground government program called Project Genesis, an experiment shrouded in mystery and marred by ethical violations. As their seemingly ordinary lives unravel, the girls find themselves on the run with their mother, Margaret, whose past holds the key to the chilling truth behind their existence. Alongside a determined detective and a remorseful scientist, the Carson family sets out to expose the sinister organization that has been hunting them. But as they fight to reveal the truth, the stakes grow higher. With powerful enemies closing in, the family must rely on their courage, resilience, and an unshakable bond to protect each other and countless others from the shadows of Project Genesis. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of the Carson family's modest kitchen, creating soft patterns on the worn linoleum floor. The room, while small and outdated, carried a sense of comfort that could only come from years of shared meals and quiet conversations. Sophia Carson, the elder of the twin sisters by 5 minutes, sat at the kitchen table with a pencil in her hand, her dark curls falling forward as she sketched the fruit bowl sitting in the middle of the table. Her sketch was meticulous, every shadow and texture rendered with precision. Her twin sister, Emily Carson, sat across from her, furiously flipping through a biology textbook. Her hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and her eyes darted across the page as if willing the information to stick. The two girls, though twins, were as different as night and day. Where Sophia saw the world in colors and emotions, Emily approached life with logic and analysis. Their mother, Margaret Carson, stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup. Her waitress uniform, neatly pressed despite its years of wear, was a testament to her meticulous nature. Margaret's face carried a gentle warmth, but her eyes revealed something deeper, a guardedness she rarely let slip. "Girls," Margaret called softly, "put the books and pencils away. Dinner is ready." Sophia put her pencil down reluctantly, sneaking one last detail into her drawing before closing the sketchbook. "Just one more shadow," she murmured. "You always say that," Emily quipped, snapping her book shut. "And then you end up adding 10 more. We are going to be late for everything because of you one day." Sophia smirked, but said nothing, enjoying the playful banter that always seemed to lighten the atmosphere. As they ate their meal, the conversation shifted to school. Sophia and Emily were juniors at Crestview High School, where they were known as the Carson twins. While their identical appearance often confused their classmates, their personalities set them apart. "Ms. Harper announced a new project today," Sophia said, her voice tinged with excitement. "We get to explore our family history. It is called Heritage Journey." "That sounds interesting," Margaret replied cautiously, though her spoon paused briefly over her bowl. Emily leaned forward. "We want to make ours stand out. Ms. Harper suggested we try a DNA test. That way, we can include our genetic history, not just family stories and photos." The room went silent for a moment. Margaret set her spoon down gently, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "That sounds unique," she said, forcing a smile. "But those tests can be expensive." "We have been saving up," Emily said quickly. "And Ms. Harper said there might be discounts for students." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, and her gaze dropped to the table. "Maybe you could just talk to Aunt Lisa. She knows so many stories about your grandparents." Sophia and Emily exchanged a glance. It was not unusual for their mother to deflect questions about their family history. They had never met their father, and Margaret rarely spoke of him. "Mom," Sophia said gently, "are you okay with this? It is just for school." Margaret looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and love. "Of course, sweetheart. If it is important to you both, Then go ahead. Her voice was soft, but the strain in her expression lingered. The next day at school, Sophia and Emily approached Miss Harper after class. The teacher, a kind woman in her early 40s with a knack for encouraging her students, listened intently as they explained their desire to incorporate a DNA test into their project. "That is a wonderful idea," Ms. Harper said, her face lighting up. "It will add a unique angle to your presentation. Let me see what I can do about the cost. We might be able to get you some help through the school's enrichment fund." "Really?" Sophia asked, her eyes wide with gratitude. Ms. Harper nodded. "You girls are hard-working and creative. If this is something you are passionate about, I am happy to support you." The twins left her classroom with renewed excitement. Sophia could not stop talking about how their project would stand out, while Emily began researching different DNA testing companies. Neither of them noticed Margaret standing at the kitchen window that evening, watching them from behind the curtain with an expression of quiet dread. A week later, a plain brown package arrived in the mail. Sophia's heart leapt as she pulled it from the mailbox and ran into the house. "They are here!" she shouted, waving the package above her head. Emily joined her at the kitchen table, and the two girls opened the box together. Inside were 2 DNA testing kits, each with a set of instructions and swabs for collecting their samples. Margaret watched from the doorway, her face pale. "Mom," Emily said, noticing her expression, "are you sure you are okay with this?" Margaret forced a smile. "I am fine. I just hope it is worth all the excitement." "It will be," Sophia said, her voice brimming with confidence. "This is going to be amazing." That evening, the twins carefully followed the instructions, swabbing their cheeks and sealing their samples in the provided containers. As they prepared to send the tests off, Margaret sat on the living room couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Upstairs in their shared bedroom, Sophia leaned back on her bed, staring at the ceiling. "Do you think this will tell us anything surprising?" Emily shrugged. "Probably not, but it will be cool to see exactly where we come from. What about you?" "I do not know," Sophia admitted. "I just feel like there is more to us than we know. Does that sound weird?" Emily shook her head. "Not weird. Just curious." The conversation lingered in Sophia's mind as she drifted off to sleep. Days turned into a week, and the twins waited anxiously for the email notifying them that their results were ready. On a crisp Friday afternoon, as they sat in the living room working on their project outline, Sophia's laptop chimed. "Emily," she called out, her voice trembling with excitement. "The results are here." The sisters huddled together on the couch, clicking the link to access their reports. As the information loaded on the screen, their excitement quickly turned to confusion. "Wait," Sophia said, frowning. This cannot be right." Emily's report displayed a detailed ancestry breakdown, showing roots in South Asia. Her screen also carried a red warning. "Genetic anomaly detected. Consult a medical professional." Sophia's report was completely different, showing strong West African ancestry and no anomalies. Emily stared at her screen, her face pale. "Sophia," she whispered, "this does not make sense. We are twins. How can we have completely different ancestries?" Sophia's heart raced as she turned to Emily. "Mom," she said, her voice urgent. "We need to talk to Mom." Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "What is it, girls?" Sophia turned the laptop toward her. "Explain this," she demanded, her voice shaking. "How is this possible?" Margaret's face drained of color. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. "Delete it," she said, her voice trembling. "Delete the email right now." "Mom," Emily said, standing up. "What is going on? Why are you so scared?" Margaret shook her head, backing away. "Please," she begged. "You do not understand. Just delete it." The twins exchanged a look of fear and confusion as Margaret retreated to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. Sophia sank back onto the couch, her hands trembling. "Emily," she whispered, "what are we going to do?" Emily sat beside her, her logical mind racing. "We are going to figure this out," she said firmly, "no matter what it takes." The two sisters sat in silence, their world suddenly tilted on its axis. Neither of them noticed the tears slipping down Margaret's cheek as she sat alone in her room, whispering, "They must never know." The Carson household felt unusually tenses the next morning. Margaret emerged from her bedroom with puffy eyes, though she smiled faintly as if trying to mask her emotions. Sophia and Emily exchanged worried glances over their bowls of cereal, but neither dared to bring up the DNA results. The silence at the breakfast table was heavy, broken only by the occasional clink of spoons against ceramic. "I'm heading to work early," Margaret finally said, grabbing her coat from the chair. "You girls have a good day at school." "Mom," Sophia said softly, stopping her, "about last night." Margaret froze, her hand tightening around the coat's collar. "Sophia, please," she said quietly, not turning around. "Just focus on your project. Don't dig too deep." She left before either twin could respond. The sound of the front door clicking shut echoed in the quiet kitchen. At school, Sophia and Emily struggled to concentrate. Sophia's thoughts swirled with questions, while Emily's logical mind raced to find answers. After lunch, they met in the library, where Emily had spent the break researching DNA anomalies on her laptop. "I found something," Emily said, keeping her voice low. She turned the screen toward Sophia, showing an article about genetic engineering experiments from decades ago. "This says some people were part of medical trials without knowing. What if—" Sophia's eyes widened. "You think Mom was part of something like that?" "It would explain why our results are so different," Emily said, "and why she's so scared." Before Sophia could respond, Ms. Harper appeared at their table, her kind smile softening the tension. "You two seem deep in thought," she said. "We are just trying to figure something out for our project," Sophia replied quickly. Ms. Harper tilted her head, studying them. "You girls seem a little stressed. Is everything okay at home?" Sophia hesitated, glancing at Emily. It was Emily who spoke, her voice steady. "We found something unusual in our DNA results. Our mom doesn't want us to look into it, but we think it might be important." Ms. Harper's expression shifted to one of gentle concern. "Sometimes parents hold back because they're trying to protect us, but if you feel this is something you need help with, you should explore it carefully." Her words gave the twins the encouragement they needed. That evening, they decided to take their concerns to someone who might have answers. Dr. Arjun Patel's office was tucked away in a quiet strip mall on the edge of town. He was a family friend of Sophia's best friend Hannah and had agreed to meet them after hours. The twins sat nervously in the small waiting room, their hands clutching the printed DNA results. "Come in," a warm voice called. Dr. Patel, a gentleman in his late 50s, greeted them with a reassuring smile. His office was cozy, filled with books and photographs of smiling families. "You must be Sophia and Emily," he said, shaking their hands. "Hannah told me a little about your situation. Let me take a look at those results." The twins watched in silence as Dr. Patel studied the papers. His face remained calm, but his eyes darkened slightly as he read Emily's anomaly warning. "This is interesting," he said, after a long pause. "Emily, the markers here suggest something unique in your genetic makeup. Have you experienced any unusual health issues or abilities?" Emily frowned. "No, I'm perfectly healthy. At least I think I am." Dr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. "This anomaly isn't necessarily bad, but it does suggest deliberate alteration. Genetic engineering, in other words." Sophia felt her stomach drop. "You mean we're not normal?" Dr. Patel's expression softened. "You are perfectly normal. You are both remarkable young women. But this? It raises questions. Your mother might know more about how this happened. Emily leaned forward. Is it possible she was part of an experiment? Dr. Patel hesitated. It's not impossible. I've heard of unethical research programs from years ago, experiments meant to enhance human genetics. If your mother was involved, it could explain why she's so reluctant to talk about it. Should we tell her we came here? Sophia asked. Dr. Patel looked at them carefully. That's up to you, but be kind. She might have been protecting you from something she thought was dangerous. When they returned home, the house was dark, except for the glow of the living room lamp. Margaret sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Where have you been? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. Sophia hesitated, but Emily stepped forward. We went to see someone who could help us understand the DNA results. Mom, we need answers. Please. Margaret's shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world had settled on her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, Sit down. The twins obeyed, their hearts pounding. Margaret took a deep breath, her hands trembling. 15 years ago, she began, I thought I was helping families who couldn't have children. I was told I would be a surrogate mother. It seemed like a way to do something good while earning money to start my own family. She paused, her eyes brimming with tears. But it wasn't what I thought. The people I worked with were experimenting. They were trying to create someone special. When I realized what they were doing, I ran. I took you both and disappeared. Sophia stared at her mother, her mind racing. So, Emily and we're part of that experiment? Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. I wanted to tell you so many times, but I was terrified they would find us. I thought if you never knew, you'd be safe. Emily's voice was calm but firm. Who are they, Mom? Are they still looking for us? Margaret looked away, her hands clenched in her lap. I don't know. I've done everything I can to stay off their radar, but they're powerful. If they find out you've been digging into this, her voice broke. I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to carry this burden. Sophia reached for her mother's hand, her voice soft. Mom, you've been protecting us our whole lives. We understand why you did what you did. Emily nodded, her analytical mind already piecing together their next steps. But we can't stop now. We need to know the truth not just for us, but for you too. Margaret hesitated, then gave a small nod. If you're going to do this, promise me you'll be careful. The twins exchanged a determined look. We will, Sophia said. As the family sat together, united by a mix of fear and resolve, none of them noticed the faint shadow of a figure lingering outside their window. Someone was watching, and the secrets Margaret had fought so hard to keep buried were about to resurface. The Carson family woke to an uneasy quiet the next morning. Margaret moved through the house with mechanical precision, making coffee and tidying up as though trying to distract herself from the weight of her confession. Sophia and Emily exchanged glances over the kitchen table, their cereal bowls untouched. Do you think she slept at all? Sophia whispered, her voice tinged with concern. Emily shook her head. I doubt it. But I've been thinking, we need to start looking for solid answers. If those people are still out there, we need to know who they are. Sophia frowned. And how do we do that? Mom's too scared to tell us more. The conversation was interrupted by Margaret, who appeared in the doorway holding her steaming coffee mug. You girls are quiet this morning, she said softly, her eyes scanning their faces. Sophia hesitated, but Emily's logical determination took over. Mom, we've been thinking. We need to figure out who's behind all this. Dr. Patel said there are people we can contact discreetly. Margaret's grip tightened on her mug, her knuckles turning white. No, it's too dangerous. Mom, Sophia said gently, we can't pretend this isn't happening. If we don't do something, they might find us anyway. Margaret's lips trembled, and for a moment, The strong, protective mother they had always known seemed impossibly fragile. "You don't understand how powerful they are," she said. "They'll do anything to keep this secret buried." Emily reached across the table, her voice steady. "That's why we have to expose them. If they're still running these experiments, other families could be in danger." Margaret stared at her daughter, her expression a mix of fear and pride. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but we do this together. No secrets, no risks without a plan." Sophia exhaled, relief washing over her. "Thank you, Mom." The first step was to revisit the DNA test results and the warning flag on Emily's report. Using the school's library computers after class, Emily dove into research while Sophia sketched absent-mindedly beside her. "Look at this," Emily said, turning the screen toward her sister. The article detailed a government-funded research program from the early 2000s, designed to study genetic enhancements. The program, called Project Genesis, had been shut down after accusations of unethical practices. Sophia's eyes widened. "This sounds exactly like what Mom described." Emily nodded. "But the records are vague. Most of the details are redacted. It's like they wanted to erase it completely." Sophia tapped her pencil against the table. "Maybe someone who worked on the project could help. You think Dr. Patel might know anyone?" "I can ask him," Emily said, jotting down notes. "But we should also talk to Ms. Harper. She's always been good at finding resources for students." The twins left the library feeling a renewed sense of purpose, though unease lingered in the back of their minds. That evening, as Margaret prepared dinner, Sophia hesitated in the doorway. "Mom," she began, "do you remember the name of the company you worked with?" Margaret froze mid-stir, her back to Sophia. "Why?" "We found some information about a project called Genesis," Sophia said cautiously. "It sounds a lot like what you described." Margaret set the spoon down and turned to face her daughter, her expression tight with worry. "Where did you find that name?" "Just in an article," Sophia said quickly. "Emily and I are being careful, I promise." Margaret sighed, leaning against the counter. "Genesis," she murmured. "Yes, that was the name. They told me it was a medical program to help families. But when I realized they were experimenting on the babies," her voice broke, and she turned away. Sophia approached her mother and placed a hand on her arm. "Mom, we're not blaming you. You did what you thought was right, and you saved us. But if they're still out there, we need to stop them." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with tears. "I'll tell you what I can," she said. The next day, Ms. Harper listened intently as Emily explained the broad strokes of what they were investigating, leaving out the most personal details. The teacher's face grew serious as she connected the dots. "You're looking into something big," Ms. Harper said. "I don't want you girls taking unnecessary risks, but I can ask around. I know a few people who might have resources for you." Sophia smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Miss Harper. We just want to understand what's going on." Miss Harper gave them a reassuring nod. "You're brave for facing this. I'll do what I can to help." Later that afternoon, Emily received an email from Dr. Patel. He had reached out to a colleague, a retired geneticist named Dr. Henry Walker, who had worked on classified projects in the early 2000s. Dr. Walker agreed to meet with them. The twins sat nervously in a small diner as they waited for the doctor. Margaret had reluctantly allowed them to go, though her anxiety was evident as she paced the house. When Dr. Walker arrived, he was a tall, thin man with salt-and-pepper hair and a cautious demeanor. He scanned the diner before approaching their table. "You must be Sophia and Emily," he said, sitting down. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "We are," Emily said. "Thank you for meeting with us." Dr. Walker folded his hands on the table. "I understand you have questions about Project Genesis. I can't tell you everything, but I can confirm that the program existed. It was designed to create enhanced human traits, intelligence, strength, even emotional resilience. Sophia frowned. But why? What was the point? Dr. Walker sighed. The official line was medical advancement, but in reality, it was about control. They wanted to create people who could be manipulated for specific purposes. Emily's jaw tightened. And the parents? Did they know? Most of them didn't, Dr. Walker admitted. The program preyed on vulnerable women who thought they were helping families. When the scandal broke, many of the records were destroyed. But some of us, he hesitated. Some of us couldn't live with what we'd done. Sophia leaned forward. Do you know who's still involved? Are they still running these experiments? Dr. Walker glanced around the diner nervously. There have been whispers. I've heard rumors that the program never really ended, just went underground. The twins exchanged a look of growing fear. If you want answers, Dr. Walker continued, you'll need to find their current base of operations. I don't know where it is, but if they've resurfaced, they'll have left a trail. As the twins returned home, the weight of their discovery hung heavy over them. Margaret sat on the couch, waiting for them, her expression guarded. What did you find out? She asked. Sophia sat beside her mother, her voice gentle. The program never really stopped, Mom. We're going to find out where they are and shut them down. Margaret shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. You don't know what you're up against. They'll come for you. They'll come for all of us. Emily knelt in front of her mother, her voice calm and steady. Then we'll be ready. You protected us once, and now it's our turn to protect you. Margaret pulled both girls into a tight embrace, her fear mingled with pride. She whispered, I'm so sorry you have to face this, but I'll stand by you, no matter what. Unbeknownst to them, a black SUV idled down the street, its engine humming quietly. Inside, a pair of cold eyes watched the house, waiting for the right moment to strike. The morning was colder than usual, the frost clinging to the edges of the Carson family's windows. Inside, Margaret Carson moved through the kitchen in a state of restless energy, her hands trembling slightly as she buttered toast for the twins. Sophia and Emily sat at the table, each lost in their thoughts. The tension from the night before still hung heavy in the air, and Margaret's unease only deepened it. Eat up, Margaret said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You've got school, and I've got work. Sophia looked up, her concern evident. Mom, maybe we should stay home today, just in case. Margaret shook her head. No, we can't live in fear. Routine is what keeps us safe. If they think we're running, they'll come faster. The twins exchanged a look, knowing their mother's advice came from years of experience. Yet, as they left for school, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. By mid-morning, Margaret's instincts proved right. As she wiped down a counter at the diner where she worked, a man in a dark suit entered and took a seat by the window. He ordered coffee, his movements calm and deliberate, but his eyes scanned the room with sharp precision. Margaret's chest tightened as she recognized the subtle but familiar presence of someone watching her. She continued working, her hands steady through sheer force of will, but when she glanced up again, the man was gone. Margaret felt a chill run through her. This was no coincidence. At school, Sophia and Emily struggled to focus during their classes. Emily's logical mind kept revisiting the information they'd uncovered about Project Genesis, trying to connect loose ends. Sophia, on the other hand, couldn't stop worrying about their mother. By lunch, they decided to talk to Ms. Harper again. I have been asking around, Ms. Harper said, when they explained their growing concerns. A friend of mine works in investigative journalism. I'll see if she can pull records on Genesis, but I have to caution you. Girls, this is dangerous territory. We know, Emily said, her voice steady, but we can't stop now. Ms. Harper nodded, her kind eyes filled with worry. Just promise me you'll stay safe. Your mother has been through enough already. That evening, as the twins walked home, Sophia noticed a car parked a few houses down from theirs. She frowned, nudging Emily. That car wasn't there this morning. Emily glanced at it, her analytical mind kicking in. It's the same one I saw near school yesterday. Their pace quickened, and by the time they reached the front door, their hearts were pounding. Inside, Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. She looked up sharply as the girls entered. "Mom, there's a car parked outside," Sophia blurted. Margaret's face drained of color. She stood and moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to peek out. When she saw the car, her hands began to tremble. "We need to leave," she said urgently, turning back to the twins. "Leave?" Emily asked. "Where would we even go?" "I have a friend who can help," Margaret said, grabbing her keys. "Get your things, just the essentials." The twins obeyed without question, throwing clothes, notebooks, and a few sentimental items into their backpacks. 10 minutes later, they were in the car, driving away from the only home they'd ever known. Margaret's friend turned out to be their neighbor, Mr. Ellis, an elderly man who had always seemed more interested in his vegetable garden than anything else. Yet, when Margaret knocked on his door, he opened it without hesitation. "I need your storm shelter," Margaret said, her voice firm but laced with desperation. Mr. Ellis raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong?" "Please," Margaret pleaded. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Follow me." The storm shelter was a small, damp space beneath Mr. Ellis's tool shed, lined with shelves of canned goods and old blankets. It smelled faintly of mildew, but it was secure and hidden. "Stay as long as you need," Mr. Ellis said, his voice gruff but kind. "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly. "Keep quiet down here," he added, handing her a battery-powered lantern. "I'll let you know if it's safe to come out." The hours crawled by in the dim shelter. Margaret sat against the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Sophia and Emily huddled together, their whispered conversations keeping the silence at bay. "Do you think they'll find us?" Sophia asked, her voice barely audible. "They already have," Margaret said quietly. "That car, it's theirs. They've been watching for weeks, maybe longer." Emily's brow furrowed. "Then why haven't they done anything yet?" "Because they don't just want to take you," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "They want to erase everything our home, your entire existence." Sophia's heart ached at the fear in her mother's voice. "Mom, we'll get through this. Together." Margaret looked at her daughter, tears brimming in her eyes. "I've spent 15 years trying to protect you from them. I never wanted you to know this kind of fear." Emily reached for her mother's hand. "We're not afraid, Mom. Not anymore. We're going to fight back." Margaret squeezed Emily's hand tightly, her fear slowly giving way to determination. By dawn, the sound of footsteps above made them all freeze. Mr. Ellis's voice drifted through the floorboards. "They're gone. Coast is clear." The family emerged cautiously, their eyes scanning the street for any signs of danger. "I'll drive you somewhere safe," Mr. Ellis offered. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, Arthur. I owe you." "Just keep those girls safe," he said firmly. Hours later, they arrived at a small, secluded cabin that belonged to one of Mr. Ellis's relatives. The place was rustic but functional, surrounded by dense woods that offered both cover and a sense of isolation. Margaret began unpacking immediately, her movements brisk and efficient. The twins helped, their earlier fear replaced by a shared resolve. "Mom," Emily said as they worked, "we need to contact someone who can help us fight this. Someone who knows the system." Margaret paused, her hands gripping the edge of a suitcase. "I know someone, an old friend. She's a detective." Sophia's eyes lit up with hope. "Then let's call her." Margaret hesitated. "She'll come, but it will put her at risk too." "We don't have a choice," Emily said. "If we keep running, they'll catch us eventually." Margaret nodded slowly. "All right, I'll call her." That evening, As the family sat together in the cabin, the quiet was interrupted by a knock at the door. Margaret tensed, but quickly moved to answer it. Standing on the porch was Detective Laura Evans, a tall, confident woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. "Margaret," Laura said, stepping inside, "you're in trouble again, aren't you?" Margaret nodded, her voice trembling. "More than ever." Laura glanced at Sophia and Emily, her expression softening. "Let's talk. I'll do everything I can to help." The twins exchanged a look of relief. For the first time in days, they felt like they might have a chance. Detective Laura Evans stood in the cabin's small, dimly lit living room, her arms crossed as she listened to Margaret Carson recount everything. Sophia and Emily sat on the worn couch, their attention fixed on their mother. The room was so silent that the creak of the wooden floor beneath Margaret's pacing feet sounded deafening. "When I ran 15 years ago, I thought I was leaving it all behind," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "But they've found us, and they'll keep coming until—" She stopped, swallowing hard, her eyes darting to her daughters. "Until they take what they think is theirs." Laura's sharp eyes softened as she stepped closer to Margaret. "You did what any mother would have done, but now we need to stop running and start fighting. I can help." Margaret's shoulders sagged as though a weight had been momentarily lifted. "What do we do, Laura? How do we keep the girls safe?" Laura leaned against the wall, her expression calm but serious. "We start by moving you to a secure safe house. This cabin won't hold if they find us. Then, we dig for answers, find out who's pulling the strings and expose them." "Expose them how?" Emily asked, her logical mind already analyzing the risks. Laura glanced at her. "You'd be surprised how quickly an operation falls apart when the right people know about it. Sunlight's the best disinfectant, as they say." By dawn, the Carson family was on the road again, this time with Laura driving. They followed a winding route through dense forest roads, avoiding highways and main streets. Margaret sat in the front seat, her hands gripping her knees tightly, while Sophia and Emily huddled together in the back. The silence stretched between them until Sophia finally spoke. "Detective Evans," she said hesitantly, "how do you know my mom?" Laura's lips quirked into a faint smile. "We go way back. Your mom and I met when I was a rookie cop. She helped me with a case, and I helped her with something she didn't want to talk about." Margaret shot her a grateful look, and Laura nodded slightly, as though silently promising to keep her secret. The safe house was a nondescript brick building nestled in the middle of a sleepy rural town. It looked like any other home on the street, with a small porch and neatly trimmed bushes lining the path to the front door. "It's not much," Laura said as she unlocked the door, "but it's secure. We'll have a team watching the perimeter, and the windows are reinforced." Inside, the house was sparse but functional. There was a small kitchen, a living room with outdated furniture, and 2 bedrooms with simple cots. Sophia wrinkled her nose at the faint smell of dust, but Emily immediately began scanning the space for any vulnerabilities. "It's perfect," Margaret said, her voice filled with relief. Laura nodded. "Make yourselves at home. I'll be in the living room setting up communications. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the family gathered in the living room with Laura to discuss their next steps. Margaret was seated at the small coffee table, a cup of tea in her trembling hands. Sophia perched on the armrest of the couch, while Emily sat cross-legged on the floor with her laptop. "We need to figure out what Project Genesis is doing now," Emily said, her eyes focused on the screen as she typed furiously. "If it's still active, there has to be a digital trail somewhere." Laura nodded. "I've got some contacts in federal investigations. I'll reach out to see what they can dig up. But we need to be careful. Any misstep could tip them off that we're onto them." Sophia, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. "Do you think there are other families like us? Other kids who were part of the experiments?" The question hung in the air like a weight. Margaret stared into her tea, her lips pressed into a thin line. Laura sighed. It's possible, she said carefully. If the program continued, there could be others who don't even know what they're part of. We have to find them, Sophia said, her voice firm. We can't let this happen to anyone else. The following morning, Emily's relentless research paid off. As the family sat together in the small dining area, she looked up from her laptop with a triumphant expression. I found something, she said, turning the screen toward Laura. There's an abandoned biotech facility across the state line. It's been flagged in a few forums as a potential site for unethical research. Laura leaned forward, studying the screen. It fits, she said. If they're operating underground, a facility like this would be perfect. Margaret's hands tightened around her coffee mug. Do you think they're holding people there? Laura's jaw tightened. We won't know until we check it out. Can we go? Sophia asked eagerly. Laura shook her head. It's too dangerous for you and Emily. Margaret and I will scout the place first. No, Margaret said firmly. If we're doing this, we do it as a family. Sophia and Emily exchanged a glance, their expressions resolute. We've already been dragged into this, Emily said. Let us help. I can analyze their systems, and Sophia's good at spotting details that most people miss. Laura hesitated, but the determination in their faces made her relent. Fine. But you listen to everything I say. No taking risks. By dusk, the family and Laura were parked a mile away from the facility. The dense woods provided cover as they moved toward the building, their footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. Laura motioned for them to stop as they reached the edge of the tree line. Through the binoculars, she scanned the perimeter of the facility, a crumbling, weathered structure with faint lights glowing from within. Security's light, she said, but that doesn't mean it's not dangerous. Sophia, crouched beside her, pointed to a side entrance partially hidden by overgrown ivy. That looks like a way in. Laura nodded. Good eye. Emily opened her laptop, which was connected to a portable hotspot. I'll try to access their external systems from here. If they're running on a local network, I might be able to map the interior. Smart, Laura said. Do it. As Emily worked, Margaret sat beside Sophia, her eyes scanning the darkened facility. I'm proud of you, she said quietly. For what? Sophia asked, surprised. For being brave, Margaret said. For wanting to help, even when it's terrifying. Sophia smiled faintly. We learned from the best. Minutes later, Emily let out a small gasp. I've got it, she whispered, showing the screen to the group. A rudimentary map of the facility's interior appeared, along with a series of labeled rooms. Laura studied the map. Good work. That'll help us navigate once we're inside. What's this room here? Sophia asked, pointing to a section labeled Research Wing. Emily frowned. It looks like a containment area. If they're holding anyone, that's where they'll be. Laura's expression hardened. Then that's where we're going. The group exchanged a glance, their resolve strengthened. Let's move, Laura said. Together, they slipped into the shadows, ready to face whatever awaited them inside the walls of the facility. The night air was cold and damp as Laura led the Carson family through the overgrown underbrush toward the facility. The wind carried the faint hum of machinery, mingling with the rustling of leaves beneath their careful steps. Sophia stayed close to Emily, her artistic mind drawn to the eerie way the moonlight filtered through the dense forest canopy. Laura stopped suddenly, raising her hand in a silent signal for them to halt. Ahead, the crumbling facade of the old biotech facility loomed, its once sleek design now marred by time and neglect. Side entrance, Laura whispered, nodding toward the ivy-covered door Sophia had spotted earlier. Stay low and keep quiet. Margaret adjusted her backpack, her lips pressed into a thin line of determination. We're ready, she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Sophia felt her mother's resolve like a lifeline. We've got this, she whispered, squeezing Emily's arm for reassurance. Emily nodded, her focus already shifting to the task ahead. "I'll handle the door. Give me a minute." The side entrance was secured with an electronic lock, its faint red glow cutting through the shadows. Emily knelt beside it, her hands moving with practiced precision as she pulled a small device from her bag and connected it to the panel. "Just like the simulations," she muttered under her breath. Sophia crouched beside her, watching with fascination. "How do you even know how to do this?" "I read," Emily replied simply, a faint smile tugging at her lips. The lock clicked open, the red light blinking off. Emily glanced up at Laura, who gave a sharp nod of approval. "Good work," Laura said. "Let's move." Inside, the facility was eerily silent. The air was heavy with the scent of disinfectant, and the faint hum of machinery seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The corridors were narrow, their walls lined with peeling paint and faded signs that hinted at the building's former purpose. Sophia felt a shiver crawl up her spine. "This place feels wrong," she whispered. Margaret placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Stay close," she said. "We'll get through this." Laura led the way, her flashlight casting long shadows as she consulted Emily's digital map. "Research wing should be straight ahead," she said. "We'll check the rooms as we go." The first few rooms were empty, their contents long since abandoned. Dust-covered desks, overturned chairs, and broken equipment spoke of a facility left in haste. But as they moved deeper, the atmosphere changed. In one room, Sophia stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. On a desk near the corner lay a stack of photographs. She picked them up, her hands trembling as she flipped through them. "Emily," she said softly, her voice tight with emotion. Emily stepped closer, her analytical mind quickly processing what she saw. The photographs depicted children, their faces marked by a mix of innocence and fear. Each image was labeled with clinical notes and serial numbers. "They were experimenting on kids," Sophia whispered, her voice breaking. "They're just kids." Margaret's face paled as she stepped into the room, her gaze falling on the photographs. "I knew they were conducting experiments, but this—" Her voice trailed off as tears filled her eyes. Laura placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We'll put an end to this, but we have to keep moving." Sophia set the photographs down gently, her heart aching for the children in the images. She exchanged a glance with Emily, their silent resolve strengthening. As they approached the research wing, the sound of muffled voices reached their ears. Laura signaled for them to stop, pressing herself against the wall as she peered around the corner. Two guards in black uniforms stood outside a heavy metal door, their postures relaxed but alert. "Looks like that's our destination," Laura whispered. "We'll need a distraction." Sophia's eyes darted to a nearby supply cart filled with empty glass jars and tools. "What about that?" she whispered. Laura followed her gaze, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Good eye." With careful precision, Sophia pushed the cart forward, the sound of glass clinking and metal wheels squeaking echoing down the hall. The guards exchanged a glance before moving toward the noise, their backs to the group. Laura acted quickly, taking the guards down with swift, practiced movements. Within seconds, they were subdued and unconscious on the floor. "Let's go," she said, motioning for the others to follow. The metal door was equipped with a biometric scanner, its green light blinking steadily. Emily frowned as she examined it. "This might take longer," she said, pulling out her tools. Before she could begin, a voice spoke from the shadows. "You'll need my help for that." The group spun around, their tension palpable. From a side corridor emerged a tall man in a lab coat, his hair streaked with gray and his face lined with years of regret. Margaret's breath hitched. "Dr. Walker?" The man nodded, his eyes filled with guilt. "I never wanted this," he said, his voice low. "They forced me to continue the experiments, but I can help you now." Laura's eyes narrowed. "Why should we trust you?" Because I want to make it right, Dr. Walker said, his gaze shifting to Sophia and Emily. I know who you are. I was part of the team that created you. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. What are you talking about? Dr. Walker hesitated, then sighed deeply. You're part of Project Genesis. Your DNA was altered before you were born. You're unique. Emily's jaw tightened. Unique how? Enhanced, Dr. Walker said simply. Your cognitive abilities, your resilience, it's all by design. Margaret stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. You did this to my children. I tried to stop it, Dr. Walker said, his voice cracking. When I couldn't, I sabotaged the program from within. It's why they shut down the facility 15 years ago. But now they're back, and they're more dangerous than ever. Sophia's mind raced, a mix of anger and fear swirling within her. If you want to help, then get us through this door. Dr. Walker nodded. I will, but you have to promise me something. What? Laura asked, her tone sharp. When this is over, you expose them. Make sure they can never do this to anyone else. Laura's gaze softened slightly. That's the plan. With Dr. Walker's help, the biometric scanner unlocked, and the metal door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside was a stark, sterile room filled with medical equipment and computer terminals. At the far end, Sophia spotted a figure bound to a chair, her dark hair falling over her face. Mom? Sophia breathed. Margaret rushed forward, tears streaming down her face as she unbound the figure. Belinda, she sobbed, pulling her into a tight embrace. The woman looked up, her eyes filled with gratitude and pain. You came for me, she whispered. Always, Margaret replied. But their reunion was cut short by the blare of an alarm. They know we're here, Laura said urgently. We need to move now. As armed operatives poured into the corridor outside, the fight for freedom began in earnest. The blaring alarm echoed through the sterile corridors, its shrill sound bouncing off the walls and mixing with the hum of machinery. Laura drew her weapon, stepping in front of the group as the first wave of armed operatives appeared at the end of the hallway. Stay behind me, she ordered, her voice sharp but calm. Margaret held tightly to Belinda, helping her stand as the woman struggled to regain her strength. Sophia and Emily clung to each other, their wide eyes fixed on the chaos unfolding around them. Dr. Walker's voice cut through the noise. There's the control room 1 floor up. If to it, we can access the facility's systems and shut this place down. Laura nodded, glancing over her shoulder. You do, she said to Sophia and Emily. To Dr. Walker and follow his lead. Margaret, help Belinda. I'll cover you. What about the operatives? Emily asked, her logical mind racing with scenarios. Laura smirked grimly. Let me worry about them. The group moved quickly through the labyrinth of hallways, Laura firing precise shots to disable the operatives who pursued them. Dr. Walker guided them toward a metal staircase at the far end of a dimly lit corridor. This way, he urged, his voice tense. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as they ascended the stairs, the alarm's relentless wail drilling into her ears. She stole a glance at Emily, who was gripping the railing tightly, her expression a mix of fear and focus. They burst into the control room, a glass-walled space overlooking a central lab. Rows of computers lined the walls, their monitors glowing with complex data streams. Emily, over here, Dr. Walker called, motioning to a central console. This is where we can access the internal systems. Emily rushed to the console, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she analyzed the interface. The security system is tied to the main server, she said, her voice steady. If I can breach it, I can disable the locks on the cells and access the live feed cameras. Do it, Laura said, standing guard at the door. Sophia hovered near her sister, watching in awe as Emily worked with unshakable determination, "You've got this," she whispered, her voice filled with admiration. Within minutes, the control room's monitors began displaying live footage from various parts of the facility. One screen showed rows of cells, each holding frightened children, their faces pale and hollow. Another displayed a lab filled with advanced medical equipment, where masked scientists worked methodically. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "Emily, look at them." Emily's fingers hesitated for a brief moment before she continued typing. "We're getting them out," she said firmly. The monitors flickered as Emily bypassed the final layer of security. Suddenly, a red prompt appeared on the screen. "Broadcast enabled." "What's that?" Sophia asked. Dr. Walker stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "The facility has a live streaming protocol for remote oversight. If you connect the cameras to an external network, you can expose everything to the outside world." Sophia's mind raced, her artistic instincts kicking in. "We can show people what's really happening here," she said. "They won't be able to hide this anymore." Emily nodded, her hands moving faster. "I'll need a few minutes to link the feeds." Laura's voice interrupted them. "We don't have a few minutes. They're regrouping." She glanced out the glass wall, spotting more operatives entering the lab below. "Dr. Walker," Laura said, her tone urgent, "how do we shut down the lab equipment?" He pointed to a secondary console. "That one controls the power supply. If you cut it, the equipment will go offline." Margaret moved to the console without hesitation. "Tell me what to do." Dr. Walker guided her through the process, his voice calm despite the tension. Moments later, the hum of the lab machinery stopped abruptly. Sophia watched as the operatives below reacted, their movements turning frantic. "They're panicking," she said. Laura nodded. "Good. That gives us an edge." Emily's voice broke through the tension. "The feeds are live. We're broadcasting to public servers." Sophia stepped up to the console, adjusting the camera angles to focus on the most compelling images. The terrified children, the abandoned cells, the cruel medical equipment. Her heart ached with every frame, but she knew the world needed to see the truth. "Show them everything," she said quietly, her hands steady despite her tears. The operatives' radios crackled with frantic voices as the broadcast gained traction. Their phones buzzed with notifications as the footage spread across social media. "They know," Dr. Walker said, a note of hope in his voice. "It's out there. They can't cover this up now." Laura turned to the group. "We've done the hard part, but we need to get out before they regroup." "What about the kids in the cells?" Sophia asked, her voice filled with urgency. Emily tapped a final command into the console. "I've unlocked the cells. The doors should open automatically." The group descended back into the facility, weaving through the hallways as the alarm blared. As they passed the now open cells, they saw the children cautiously stepping out, their eyes wide with fear. Sophia knelt beside a small boy clutching a tattered blanket. "It's okay," she said softly. "We're here to help." The boy hesitated before taking her hand, his trust filling Sophia with a fierce determination. "Everyone follows us," Laura called, motioning for the children to move toward the exit. The operatives were in disarray as the group reached the facility's main doors. Outside, the faint sound of sirens signaled the arrival of law enforcement, drawn by the widespread broadcast. Laura ushered the children out, her sharp eyes scanning for any remaining threats. Margaret and Belinda helped guide the weaker ones, their maternal instincts taking over. Sophia and Emily stayed close to the group, their hearts pounding as they stepped into the cool night air. The chaos began to subside as the children were loaded into waiting ambulances and officers moved to secure the facility. Margaret held Sophia and Emily tightly, her tears falling freely. "We did it," she whispered. Sophia looked up at the starry sky, her chest swelling with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "No one else will have to go through this," she said. Laura approached them, her expression softening. "You girls were incredible," she said. "You've done something that will change lives." Emily's voice was steady, but her eyes glistened with emotion. "We couldn't have done it without you." Dr. Walker stood nearby, his face lined with regret, but also hope. "You've made me believe we can fix this," he said. Sophia stepped forward, her voice firm. "We will." The first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting the scene in a golden glow. Together, they stood in quiet solidarity, knowing that while the battle was over, the journey to rebuild had just begun. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of orange and pink as the Carson family, Detective Laura Evans, and Dr. Walker stood together outside the now exposed facility. Ambulances and police cars crowded the dirt lot, their lights casting red and blue flashes across the group of rescued children. Margaret held Sophia and Emily close, her arms wrapped around their shoulders as though she might never let go. "It's over," Sophia murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of activity around them. Laura placed a hand on her shoulder, her expression steady but kind. "No, not yet. This was just the beginning." Margaret turned to her, fear flickering in her eyes. "You think they'll retaliate?" "They might," Laura admitted. "But the footage is everywhere now. News outlets are already running it. The world knows, and that makes it harder for them to hide." Dr. Walker stepped forward, his shoulders sagging, as though the weight of years of guilt had finally caught up with him. "The organization will regroup," he said. "They always do. But this will set them back significantly." Sophia looked at him, her artistic mind struggling to reconcile the man in front of her with the cruelty of the experiments. "Why are you helping us now?" she asked. Walker's face was grave, his voice quiet. "Because I couldn't before. But seeing you, knowing you fought back, it gave me hope that we can stop them for good." By mid-morning, the group had been transported to a secure location, a government safe house arranged by Laura. The house was larger and more modern than the one they'd fled before, with reinforced walls and cameras monitoring every angle. Though it was meant to be a place of safety, its starkness made it feel cold. The twins sat in the small living room, staring at the muted television as news anchors debated the implications of the broadcast. Images of the facility's labs and the children's faces flashed across the screen, drawing a mix of outrage and sorrow from commentators. "They're calling it the biggest medical scandal in decades," Emily said, her voice flat. Sophia nodded, her arms wrapped around her knees. "At least people know now. That has to mean something." "It means everything," Margaret said, sitting down beside them. "You two have done more than I ever could. You've shown the world the truth." In another room, Laura was on the phone with an official from the Department of Justice, her tone sharp and professional. "Yes, they're safe," she said. "But this isn't over. We need to go after the organization's leaders." She paused, listening intently before her face darkened. "I understand the legal process takes time, but these people are dangerous. They won't stop because of bad press." As she hung up, Dr. Walker entered, his expression grim. "They're already trying to spin the narrative," he said, "claiming the footage was fabricated, that the children were actors. They'll do whatever it takes to bury this." Laura nodded, her jaw tightening. "Let them try. We've got more than enough evidence to prove otherwise." That afternoon, Sophia and Emily wandered into the backyard of the safe house, seeking a moment of peace. The yard was enclosed by tall fences, but the late autumn sunlight filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows on the grass. Sophia found a patch of dirt and knelt down, tracing shapes in the soil with a stick. Emily sat beside her, her sharp mind still processing everything that had happened. "Do you think Mom will ever stop being scared?" Sophia asked, her voice tinged with sadness. Emily considered the question, her gaze thoughtful. "I think she'll always worry, but I also think she's proud of us." Sophia smiled faintly. "She is, I can tell." Emily hesitated before speaking again. "What about you?" Are you okay? Sophia shrugged, her stick still moving in the dirt. I'm scared too, but I'm glad we didn't back down. Those kids, they deserved better. We gave them a chance. Emily reached over, resting a hand on her sister's. You're braver than you think, you know. Sophia looked up, meeting Emily's steady gaze. So are you. Inside the house, Laura and Dr. Walker pored over the files recovered from the facility. Margaret joined them, her hands still trembling slightly as she placed a cup of coffee in front of Laura. What are you hoping to find? Margaret asked. Names, Laura said simply. Who funded this? Who ordered it? Who knew about it? Walker nodded. If we can identify the key players, we can dismantle the operation entirely. Margaret sat down across from them, her eyes narrowing. And what happens to them? Prison? A slap on the wrist? They'll face justice, Laura said firmly. We'll make sure of it. As night fell, the family gathered around the small dining table for a quiet dinner. The tension from the day lingered, but there was a sense of tentative hope as well. Do you think we'll ever go back home? Sophia asked, breaking the silence. Margaret hesitated, her fork poised over her plate. Maybe, someday, but for now, we stay here, together. Laura, who had joined them at the table, leaned forward. Your home might not feel safe right now, but what you've done has created a ripple effect. People are watching, asking questions. That's how change starts. Sophia nodded, her artistic mind imagining the ripples spreading outward, touching lives she'd never even know. Later that evening, Emily sat on her cot, staring at her laptop. She'd been combing through the data Dr. Walker had provided, searching for patterns and connections. Finally, she found something. Mom, she called, her voice urgent. Margaret and Laura entered the room, their expressions wary. I found a list of transactions tied to the facility, Emily said, pointing to the screen. These names their corporations and private donors. Some of them are major players in the tech and biotech industries. Laura's brow furrowed as she studied the list. This is big. If we can trace the money, we can expose everyone involved. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. Do it, whatever it takes. The next morning, Laura made a call to a trusted journalist, someone she knew wouldn't back down under pressure. I've got a lead for you, she said. But you need to be prepared for backlash. This isn't just a story, it's a fight. As she hung up, she turned to Margaret, Sophia, and Emily, her expression resolute. We're going to take them down, one step at a time. Margaret nodded, her fear giving way to determination. Then let's start walking. Far away, in a darkened boardroom, the remnants of the organization watched the news with grim expressions. One man, his face shadowed, turned to his colleagues. They've exposed one piece, he said coldly. But they haven't seen the whole picture. We'll remind them who they're dealing with. Back at the safe house, Sophia sketched quietly in her notebook, drawing a scene of ripples spreading across a vast lake. Emily sat beside her, their bond stronger than ever. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew they would face it together with resilience, courage, and hope. The quiet of the safe house was deceptive. Inside, every room buzzed with activity. Laura sat in the corner of the living room, typing furiously on her laptop, her phone vibrating every few minutes with calls from trusted contacts. Margaret worked alongside Dr. Walker, helping sort through recovered documents that tied major corporations to Project Genesis. Sophia and Emily stayed in the kitchen, where Emily's laptop hummed as she mapped the financial trails leading from the shuttered facility to powerful players. Sophia doodled absent-mindedly on a scrap of paper, her mind spinning with everything they had uncovered. Emily, Sophia said, breaking the silence, do you think we'll ever stop running? Emily paused, her eyes scanning the glowing screen. I think if we can expose enough of this, they won't have anywhere to hide. But until then, Sophia nodded, her heart heavy. It's like we're fighting a ghost. We know it's there, but it keeps slipping through our fingers. Emily looked up, her gaze steady. "We'll catch it, Sophie. We just need to keep going." By mid-morning, Laura received a call that sent a ripple through the house. Her contact at the Justice Department had confirmed an imminent raid on one of the corporations tied to Project Genesis. "They're going after one of the major players," Laura announced as she hung up the phone. "A biotech firm that funneled millions into the program. If they find solid evidence, it could blow the whole operation wide open." Margaret leaned against the table, her expression wary. "But what happens if they don't? These people are experts at covering their tracks." Dr. Walker spoke up, his voice firm. "They might be powerful, but they're not invincible. This is the most attention the program has ever gotten. They're scrambling, and that makes them vulnerable." Sophia looked at Laura, hope flickering in her eyes. "Does this mean we're winning?" Laura smiled faintly. "It means we've got a shot, but we can't stop now." The news broke that afternoon. Federal agents had raided the headquarters of Nexus Biotech, seizing boxes of documents and computer servers. The footage aired on every major network, and anchors speculated on the implications of such a high-profile raid. Sophia and Emily watched the coverage from the living room, their emotions a mix of triumph and trepidation. "This is big," Emily said, her analytical mind already racing with possibilities. "If the agents find direct connections to the facility, it could unravel everything." Sophia nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her sketchbook. "Do you think they'll come after us now? To silence us?" "They won't stop trying," Margaret said from the doorway. "But we're not alone anymore. The world is watching." That evening, Laura received a message from her journalist contact, a woman named Anne Monroe. The email contained an urgent request. "We need an interview with the twins. The public needs to hear their story." Laura hesitated, knowing the risk. But as she looked at Sophia and Emily, who sat side by side on the couch, she realized that their voices might be the key to turning the tide. "You might not like this," Laura said as she approached them, "but there's a reporter who wants to interview you. She thinks your story could make a difference." Margaret immediately shook her head. "Absolutely not. They've been through enough." Emily looked up, her expression thoughtful. "Mom, if telling our story helps stop these people, isn't it worth it?" Margaret's jaw tightened, fear flashing in her eyes. "They'll make you targets, even more than you already are." Sophia reached for her mother's hand, her voice soft but firm. "We already are, Mom, but if we can help even one person, it's worth the risk." Laura placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We'll take every precaution. Anne is trustworthy, and we'll conduct the interview remotely. You'll still have control over what's shared." After a long silence, Margaret nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but if it gets too dangerous, we pull out." The next day, Anne Monroe conducted the interview via a secure video call. Sophia and Emily sat side by side, their hands clasped tightly as they recounted their journey. They spoke about the DNA test that started everything, the discovery of Project Genesis, and the horrors they had witnessed in the facility. Anne listened intently, her questions measured and empathetic. "What do you hope to achieve by sharing your story?" she asked. Emily answered first, her voice steady. "We want the world to know the truth. We want to stop this from happening to anyone else." Sophia added, her tone tinged with emotion. "We didn't choose to be part of this, but we can choose to fight back. That's what matters." As the interview ended, Anne promised to handle their story with care. "You're brave," she said. "The world needs more people like you." The story aired that evening, a feature segment on one of the nation's largest news networks. Footage from the facility played alongside Sophia and Emily's testimony, their faces blurred for security reasons. The report sparked an immediate reaction, with viewers flooding social media with calls for justice. At the safe house, the family watched in silence as the broadcast ended. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes, pulling her daughters into a tight embrace. "You've done something incredible," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Sophia looked at Emily, their bond stronger than ever. "We did it together," she said. But as the night wore on, a darker undercurrent emerged. Comments on social media turned from support to speculation. Some questioned the authenticity of the footage, while others accused the family of seeking attention. Margaret sat in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the responses. "What if this backfire?" she asked Laura, who stood nearby. "It won't," Laura said firmly. "The truth is out there now, and we have more allies than enemies." Far from the safe house in a shadowy office, the remnants of Project Genesis gathered around a screen displaying the interview. "They're gaining too much traction," one man said, his voice cold. "We need to neutralize the threat." Another leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Start with the reporter. Cut the story off at the source." Unaware of the looming threat, the Carson family prepared for the next step in their fight. Emily continued tracing financial trails, while Sophia sketched plans for a potential public art installation to honor the rescued children. "We're not done yet," Sophia said, her pencil moving across the page. "No," Emily agreed, her eyes fixed on the screen. "But we're closer than ever." As the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, the family sat together, united by their shared purpose. They didn't know what the future held, but they were ready to face it together with truth, resilience, and unwavering hope. The safe house felt different in the early morning light. The air was still heavy with tension, but there was a palpable sense of accomplishment that hadn't been there before. Sophia sat on the back porch, sketchbook balanced on her knees, while Emily typed furiously on her laptop inside. Margaret emerged with 2 cups of tea, handing one to Sophia before sitting beside her. "You've been quiet this morning," Margaret said softly. Sophia shrugged, her pencil moving across the page in slow, deliberate strokes. "Just thinking," she said, "about everything we've been through, about what's next." Margaret placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "What's next is up to us. We've faced the worst of it, and we're still standing. That means something." Sophia nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "It does." Inside, Emily leaned back in her chair, a satisfied expression on her face. "I've traced another financial connection," she called out, drawing Laura's attention. Laura, who had been scanning the latest news reports, approached the table. "What did you find?" Emily turned the laptop toward her. "There's a private trust that funneled millions into the facility over the last 3 years. It's linked to a hedge fund in New York. If we follow this trail, we might find the people running the operation." Laura studied the screen, her brow furrowing. "Good work, Emily. This could be the breakthrough we need." Margaret entered the room, her tea still in hand. "But how do we get this information to someone who can use it? We can't just post it online." "I'll reach out to Anne," Laura said. "She has connections in law enforcement. If we can give her enough evidence, she can push for more arrests." Margaret nodded, her fears slowly giving way to cautious hope. By midday, the ripple effect of the twins' interview was in full swing. News outlets were running follow-up stories, and calls for justice grew louder with each passing hour. Yet, amidst the surge of support, there were ominous undercurrents. Anne Monroe, the journalist who had shared their story, called Laura with an urgent warning. "I've been followed twice today," Anne said, her voice tight. "They're trying to intimidate me." Laura's jaw clenched. "Stay somewhere secure. I'll make sure you're protected." But Anne's words hung in the air, a stark reminder that the fight was far from over. That evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Laura laid out their next steps. "The more we uncover, the more desperate they'll get," she said. "We have to stay vigilant." "Do you think they'll come after us?" Sophia asked, her voice steady but laced with concern. "They might," Laura admitted. "But we're not alone anymore. Law enforcement is involved now. So are journalists, advocates, and countless people who saw your story. They'll be watching too. Margaret placed a protective arm around her daughters. "We'll be ready," she said. The next morning, an unexpected knock on the door brought the house to a standstill. Laura motioned for everyone to stay back as she approached, her weapon drawn. "Who is it?" she called through the door. "It's Anne," came the reply. "I need to talk to you." Laura opened the door cautiously, her sharp gaze scanning the street before stepping aside to let Anne in. The journalist looked shaken, but determined. "I have something for you," she said, handing Laura a USB drive. "A source sent this to me anonymously. It's a list of names people connected to Project Genesis." Laura's eyes widened as she took the drive. "This could change everything." Anne nodded. "But it's risky. These people are powerful, and they'll do anything to protect themselves." Sophia stepped forward, her voice firm. "Then we have to make sure they can't." The following hours were a whirlwind of activity. Emily pored over the data on the drive, identifying connections between high-profile individuals and the now exposed facility. Margaret and Dr. Walker worked on compiling the information into a cohesive report, while Laura coordinated with law enforcement to ensure the evidence reached the right people. Sophia, meanwhile, focused on creating a visual representation of their findings, a web of connections that tied names, corporations, and funding sources to the atrocities of Project Genesis. "This will make it easier for people to understand," Sophia said, as she showed her work to Emily. Emily nodded, a spark of admiration in her eyes. "You've captured it perfectly." As night fell, the family gathered one final time in the living room. The weight of their journey was etched into their faces, but so was their resolve. "We've done everything we can," Laura said, her voice steady. "Now it's up to the system to hold these people accountable." Margaret looked at her daughters, pride shining through her exhaustion. "No matter what happens, I'm so proud of you both. You've shown more strength and courage than I ever imagined." Sophia leaned into her mother's embrace. "We learned it from you." The next morning, news broke of additional raids and arrests. The ripple effect of their actions had grown into a tidal wave, sweeping away the shadows that had hidden Project Genesis for so long. Standing on the back porch, Sophia and Emily watched the sunrise, its golden light spilling over the horizon. "We did it," Sophia said softly. Emily nodded, her voice filled with quiet determination. "And we'll keep going. For the people they hurt, and for the ones who can't fight back." Far away, in a quiet office, the remnants of Project Genesis met for the last time. The man who had orchestrated much of the program stared at the headlines with cold fury. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low, not by a long shot. But his words carried less weight now, drowned out by the voices of those who had fought for the truth. Back at the safe house, the Carson family began packing their belongings. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, they felt a sense of peace. As they loaded the car, Margaret turned to Laura. "Thank you. For everything." Laura smiled faintly. "Just promise me you'll keep fighting." Margaret nodded, her gaze drifting to her daughters. "We will." As they drove away, the horizon stretched before them, wide and open with possibility. They were no longer running. They were moving forward, toward a brighter tomorrow, filled with resilience, courage, and hope. The road stretched endlessly before the Carson family as they drove toward a new beginning. The fear and uncertainty that had once defined their lives were slowly being replaced by hope and determination. Margaret glanced at Sophia and Emily in the back seat, their bond stronger than ever after all they had endured. "You girls have changed the world," Margaret said softly, her voice filled with pride. Sophia smiled, her artistic mind already dreaming of how to document their journey. "We're just getting started, Mom." Emily nodded, her logical mind piecing together the steps they would take next. This is only the beginning. In the quiet car, the family sat together, united not by the shadows of their past, but by the light of their future. They weren't just survivors, they were change-makers, ready to face whatever came next with courage and hope. If this story moved you, inspired you, or gave you hope, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Together, we can share tales of resilience, courage, and the power of truth to change the world. Hit the subscribe button and join us as we explore more stories that remind us all to keep fighting for what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.